You're lying in bed, thumb moving almost unconsciously across the glowing screen. Left, left, right, left. Faces appear and disappear in seconds. People who spent time choosing these photos, writing these bios, hoping to catch someone's attention. Somewhere out there, someone is probably swiping past your face right now, making the same split-second judgment. It feels almost like a game, this rapid-fire evaluation of potential partners. Match. Your heart does that little flutter. You message, they don't respond. You keep swiping. This is dating now, and it would be absolutely incomprehensible to your great-great-grandparents. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. If you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet, where we explore fascinating stories designed to ease you gently into sleep. Wherever you are right now, I'm so glad you've decided to join me for tonight's adventure. Tonight, we're exploring one of the most fundamental human experiences, the search for romantic connection. For thousands of years, the question of how people find partners has been answered in radically different ways. We've gone from marriages where couples met for the first time at their own weddings to a world where you can browse thousands of potential matches while lying in bed. How did we get here? What did previous generations do? And what does the history of courtship reveal about what we're looking for now? So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's journey together through the surprisingly dramatic history of dating. Our story begins not with apps or dinner dates, but with families negotiating bride prices in ancient civilizations. In the warm glow of oil lamps in ancient Egypt, a young woman named Merit sits quietly while her father negotiates with another family. She's 15 years old, considered the perfect age for marriage, and she's meeting her future husband for perhaps the second time in her life. There's no dinner date planned, no getting-to-know-you phase, no wondering if he'll call. The contract is being written, the bride price discussed, and within weeks she'll move into his household. This isn't a tragedy or an unusual situation. It's simply how things were done, how they'd been done for thousands of years, and how they would continue for thousands more. For most of human history, what we call dating simply didn't exist. Marriage was far too important to be left to the whims of young people and their unpredictable emotions. It was an economic arrangement, a political alliance, a way of transferring property and establishing family connections. Love, if it came at all, was expected to develop after the wedding, not before. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriages were legal contracts that fathers negotiated on behalf of their daughters. These weren't casual agreements. They were recorded on clay tablets, witnessed by officials, and backed by detailed laws. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to around 1750 BCE, includes dozens of regulations about marriage contracts, divorce procedures, and the financial obligations of husbands. Marriage was serious business, literally. A man paid a bride price to the woman's family, compensating them for the loss of her labor and her reproductive capacity. In return, the bride's family provided a dowry, property or goods that would support the new household. What's fascinating is that these ancient systems weren't entirely without consideration for the individuals involved. In some cases, women could refuse particularly objectionable matches. Egyptian women, remarkably, had significant legal rights compared to women in other ancient civilizations. They could own property, initiate divorce, and even run businesses. While marriages were still typically arranged by families, Egyptian couples could sometimes exercise choice, and romantic love poetry from ancient Egypt suggests that emotional connection was valued even within arranged systems. The love poetry that survives from ancient Egypt is breathtakingly tender and surprisingly modern in its sentiments. One poem describes a young man's heart racing when he sees his beloved. Another speaks of love as a kind of sweet sickness that makes food tasteless and sleep impossible. These weren't poems about arranged strangers. They suggest that romance could bloom even within structured courtship systems, that young people found ways to develop genuine feeling within the frameworks their societies provided. Ancient Greece presents a more complicated picture. In Athens, marriage was primarily about producing legitimate heirs to inherit property. Citizen men might marry in their 30s to teenage girls who'd been selected by their fathers. The relationship between husband and wife was formal and distant. Emotional intimacy and intellectual companionship were sought outside marriage, often with courtesans or in the complex system of older male mentorship of younger men. The idea that a man and his wife might be best friends, might share deep emotional connection, would have seemed odd to classical Athenians. Yet even in ancient Athens, people fell in love in ways that defied social structure. Mythology is filled with stories of passionate, transformative love. Odysseus yearning for Penelope, Orpheus descending to the underworld for Eurydice. These stories acknowledged what everyone knew. The human heart often ignores what's practical or approved. The tension between social expectations and individual desire is ancient, perhaps as old as civilization itself. Rome took a more pragmatic approach. Among the elite, marriage was explicitly political. Families formed alliances through marriage, united fortunes, and consolidated power. A senator might marry his daughter to a wealthy merchant to gain financial backing, or to another political family to secure voting blocs. These marriages were arranged by fathers, with the bride having little say. The wedding itself wasn't even necessarily attended by the bride and groom. Sometimes contracts were signed and marriages legally recognized without the couple being present. But Rome also recognized different types of marriage with varying levels of formality. The most formal marriages, with elaborate ceremonies and legal weight, were reserved for the upper classes. Common people might enter informal unions that had social recognition without legal standing. And Roman law evolved over centuries to give women more autonomy, including the right to divorce their husbands, though the social consequences of divorce could be severe, particularly for women. In ancient China, marriage was understood as the union of two families, not two individuals. The concept of filial piety, respect and obedience toward one's parents, meant that children had obligations to marry according to their parents' wishes. Marriages were arranged by families, often with the help of professional matchmakers who would consider compatibility based on birth dates, astrological signs, and family backgrounds. The couple might not meet until their wedding day, though in some cases, brief, supervised meetings were permitted. Chinese tradition included beautiful rituals that acknowledged the significance of marriage even within this arranged system. The exchange of gifts between families, the bride's elaborate costume and headdress, the tea ceremony where the new couple served tea to their elders. These rituals marked the transition and honored both families. Romance, as a concept, wasn't entirely absent. Chinese literature includes love stories, though often tragic ones about couples whose love defied social expectations and led to unhappy endings. What's striking about all these ancient systems is how explicitly they acknowledged what modern romantic culture often tries to obscure. Marriage has always been about more than love. It's about economics, about property transfer, about establishing kinship networks, about producing legitimate heirs. Our ancestors weren't necessarily cynical about love. They simply understood that marriage was too important to the fabric of society to be based solely on the unpredictable emotions of young people. Yet the poetry, songs, and stories that survived from ancient civilizations make clear that people still fell in love, still yearned for connection that transcended practical arrangements. Young people still found ways to express preference, to communicate interest, to pursue feeling within the boundaries their societies drew. The tension between individual desire and social structure, between romantic love and practical consideration, between what the heart wants and what society expects. That tension has always been part of the human experience of courtship and connection. Picture a great hall in 12th century France, torches flickering against stone walls. A troubadour stands before the assembled nobles, his voice carrying a song about a knight's impossible love for a noblewoman. She's married to another, beautiful beyond compare, and forever out of reach. The knight serves her faithfully, performs great deeds in her name, and suffers exquisitely from his unfulfilled desire. The audience listens raptly, finding this story of unrequited love not tragic, but somehow beautifully elevated, proof of the knight's nobility of spirit. This is courtly love, and it would fundamentally reshape how Western culture thought about romance. The medieval period presents a fascinating paradox. On one hand, marriage among the nobility remained ruthlessly practical. Alliances were forged between powerful families, with children betrothed in infancy and married off as teenagers to cement political bonds. Love within marriage wasn't expected or particularly valued. On the other hand, the 12th century saw the emergence of an entirely new cultural concept: romantic love as an ennobling force, as something valuable in itself, as the highest expression of human emotion. Courtly love, or finamour, as it was called in the Occitan language of southern France, was a highly structured form of romance that existed almost entirely outside of marriage. The ideal courtly lover was a knight who devoted himself to a lady of higher social status, usually already married. He would perform brave deeds in her honor, compose poetry celebrating her beauty and virtue, and maintain absolute discretion about their relationship. The lady, in turn, would grant or withhold her favor, according to elaborate rules of behavior. What made courtly love revolutionary was its elevation of women to positions of power. In the courtly love tradition, the lady was the authority figure, the one who set conditions and determined when and how the relationship would progress. The knight was her servant, bound to obey her wishes and prove himself worthy through his actions. This represented a dramatic reversal of typical medieval power dynamics, where women had little authority outside their management of households. The connection between courtly love and actual behavior is debated by historians. Some believe courtly love was purely literary fantasy, a game played in poetry and song that bore little resemblance to real relationships. Others argue that it reflected and influenced actual courtship practices among the nobility, creating space for flirtation and romance within tightly controlled social structures. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Courtly love provided a framework for thinking about romantic emotion, even if its practices were more aspirational than real. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period, is often credited with popularizing courtly love traditions. Her court became famous for elaborate games of love, for poetry competitions, and for supposedly holding courts of love, where noble ladies would hear cases and issue rulings on questions of romantic behavior. Whether these courts actually existed is uncertain, but the stories about them reveal how revolutionary this new way of thinking about romance really was. The most famous piece of courtly love literature is probably The Art of Courtly Love by Andreas Capellanus, written around 1190. This treatise lays out elaborate rules for lovers: that love and marriage are incompatible, that lovers must suffer with jealousy, that secrecy is essential, that the lover must turn pale in the beloved's presence. Reading it today feels almost like satire, so specific and overwrought are the rules. But it was taken seriously in its time, providing a framework for thinking about romantic love as something distinct from marriage, procreation, or practical partnership. The influence of courtly love on Western romantic culture cannot be overstated. Before this tradition emerged, romantic love wasn't considered particularly important or valuable. After courtly love became part of cultural consciousness, romantic love began to be seen as ennobling, as evidence of refined sensibility, as something worth pursuing even at great personal cost. The idea that true love might require sacrifice, that it might be incompatible with practical considerations, that suffering for love proves its authenticity. These ideas all trace back to courtly love traditions. Of course, for ordinary medieval people, courtship looked very different from these aristocratic fantasies. Peasant marriages were arranged by families, but often took local preference into account. Young people might meet at village festivals, at church, or while working in fields. Marriages usually happened within the same village or between neighboring villages, joining families who already knew each other. While romance wasn't the primary consideration, some choice existed. A woman might refuse a suitor she found particularly objectionable, and young people often had some say in whether they would accept a proposed match. The Catholic Church played an increasingly important role in regulating marriage during the medieval period. The Church insisted that marriage required the free consent of both parties, which theoretically gave women some protection against being forced into unwanted unions. In practice, the line between genuine consent and coerced acceptance was often blurry, particularly when family pressure and economic necessity made refusal nearly impossible. But the principle that marriage required consent represented an important philosophical shift. The Church also insisted on public marriage ceremonies and gradually developed elaborate rituals around weddings. Marriages were announced in advance through banns read at church services, giving the community opportunity to object if there were impediments. The ceremony itself became more formalized, moving from private family arrangements to public religious events. This shift made marriage more of a community concern and less purely a private family matter. Medieval courtship among the common classes involved practical demonstrations of suitability. A young man might work for his future father-in-law, proving he could provide for a family. Couples might be betrothed for months or years before marriage, allowing them to know each other better before committing. These betrothals were taken seriously. Breaking them could lead to legal consequences, and betrothed couples were sometimes allowed forms of physical intimacy that would have been scandalous for unattached young people. What's touching about medieval courtship is how ordinary people found ways to express romance within practical constraints. Love tokens were exchanged. A carved wooden spoon, a carefully embroidered handkerchief, a lock of hair. Young people might communicate through songs, through messages carried by friends, through significant glances at church. The framework was structured and supervised, but human feeling still found expression. The medieval period thus gave us a strange inheritance. On one hand, the elevation of romantic love as the highest human emotion, as something worth suffering for, as proof of nobility of spirit. On the other hand, the continued practical reality that marriage was an economic and social arrangement where love was pleasant if it occurred, but not essential. This tension between the romantic ideal and practical reality, between what we're taught to want and what we're advised to choose, has echoed through Western culture ever since. The afternoon sun streams through lace curtains into a meticulously maintained Victorian parlor. A young woman in a high-necked dress sits rigidly upright on a horsehair sofa, hands folded in her lap. Across from her, equally rigid, sits a young man in a dark suit. Her mother occupies a chair by the window, ostensibly focused on her embroidery, but acutely aware of every word and gesture exchanged by the young couple. They've been sitting like this for precisely 20 minutes. Any shorter would be rude, any longer would be improper. This is courtship in the 19th century, and every moment is governed by rules so complex they required entire books to explain. The Victorian era represents perhaps the high-water mark of structured, supervised courtship in Western culture. This wasn't a return to medieval arranged marriage. By the 1800s, the idea that young people should have some choice in partners was well established. But it was choice exercised within incredibly rigid frameworks designed to protect reputations, ensure class-appropriate matches, and prevent any possibility of sexual impropriety before marriage. The process began with introductions, which could only happen through mutual acquaintances or at approved social events. A young man couldn't simply approach a young woman on the street. That would have been scandalous. Instead, he needed to be formally introduced by someone known to both families. This system ensured that courtship happened within appropriate social circles, and that families could investigate potential suitors' backgrounds and financial situations before allowing any romantic attachment to develop. Once properly introduced, a gentleman could call upon a young lady at her family home. But even this simple act was governed by elaborate rules. He would first leave his calling card, a small printed card with his name and sometimes address. If the family was willing to receive him, they would invite him to call during specific hours. Calling hours were typically in the afternoon, and visits were expected to last between 15 and 30 minutes. Staying longer might suggest overfamiliarity. During these calls, the couple was never alone. A mother, aunt, or other chaperone would always be present, ostensibly occupied with her own activities, but actually monitoring every interaction. Conversation was expected to be light and proper. Discussion of serious topics, personal matters, or anything that might stir emotion was inappropriate. The goal was to allow the couple to become acquainted while preventing any intimacy that might compromise the young woman's reputation. The emphasis on reputation, particularly female reputation, cannot be overstated. A young woman whose reputation was damaged by being seen alone with a man, by being too forward, by showing too much interest in a suitor who hadn't formally declared his intentions, could find herself unmarriageable. The double standard was stark. Men's reputations were far more resilient, while women bore the full burden of propriety. A woman had to be interested but not too interested, welcoming but not forward, attractive but not alluring. Victorians developed elaborate nonverbal communication systems to navigate these restrictive rules. The language of flowers allowed young people to send coded messages through bouquets. Red roses meant passionate love, yellow roses friendship, white roses purity. But it went much deeper. A carnation might mean pride or fascination depending on its color. A lily could represent purity or death depending on variety. An entire conversation could happen through flower selection. Though whether ordinary young people actually knew all these meanings, or whether this was more aspirational than real remains debated. Similarly, the language of the fan supposedly allowed young women to communicate through fan movements. A fan drawn across the cheek meant, "I love you," while a fan held over the heart meant, "You have won my heart." Historians debate how widely these fan codes were actually used, but their existence in etiquette books reveals the Victorian desire for systems that allowed communication within strict propriety rules. Letter writing provided one of the few opportunities for more personal communication, though even this was regulated. Young people could correspond once a relationship reached a certain stage, but letters were often read by parents or guardians. Love letters existed, but they had to balance genuine emotion with appropriate reserve. Too much passion was improper, too little suggested insincerity. The ability to write a properly emotional but still proper love letter was a valued skill. As a relationship progressed and serious intentions became clear, a young man would need to formally ask the young woman's father for permission to court her with the intention of marriage. This wasn't mere tradition. A father's refusal could effectively end the relationship, particularly if the suitor lacked sufficient means or social standing. Once permission was granted, the couple might be allowed slightly more freedom. Longer visits, perhaps brief walks together, still chaperoned, more personal conversation. Engagement brought its own elaborate protocols. The man would propose, ideally in a romantic but still proper setting, offering a ring. The engagement would be announced publicly, allowing the couple to be seen together more freely, though still chaperoned. The engagement period gave families time to prepare for the wedding, and importantly, for the couple to confirm their compatibility. Broken engagements were socially difficult but not impossible, particularly if the breach came from legitimate cause rather than simple change of heart. What's remarkable about Victorian courtship is how it managed to be simultaneously deeply romantic and highly pragmatic. Young people were encouraged to marry for love. The idea of companionate marriage, where partners were friends and partners, had become culturally important. But that love was expected to develop within appropriate bounds between suitable partners, with proper consideration of economic and social compatibility. The Victorian period produced some of the most romantic literature in English. Think of the Brontes, of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, while simultaneously maintaining strict social control over actual romantic behavior. The working classes, as always, had more flexibility and fewer resources for elaborate courtship rituals. Working young women and men might meet at factories, in shops, or at church socials. Chaperoning was less strict, partly because housing constraints made constant supervision impractical. Courtship might involve walking out together after work, attending public entertainments, or joining group activities with other young people. The engagement period might be longer, as couples saved money to establish households. Working-class courtship was less idealized, but perhaps more equal, as both parties contributed economically to the future household. The Victorian era also saw the rise of advice literature about courtship and marriage. Books and magazine articles offered detailed guidance on every aspect of courtship, from appropriate conversation topics to proper wedding etiquette. These advice columns reveal anxieties about social mobility and changing norms. As cities grew and traditional community oversight weakened, middle-class families worried about maintaining standards and ensuring their daughters made suitable matches. Underneath all this propriety and structure, of course, real human beings still fell in love, experienced desire, and sometimes broke the rules. Breaches of etiquette happened, secret meetings occurred, and unplanned pregnancies forced hasty marriages. The rigid system existed partly because human nature kept pushing against boundaries. Because without elaborate rules, young people might follow their hearts and hormones rather than practical considerations and social expectations. It's 1925, and a young woman named Betty is getting ready for the evening. But she's not preparing to receive a gentleman caller in her family's parlor. Instead, she's putting on lipstick, a recently acceptable practice, and a dress that shows her ankles and has a dropped waist. She's meeting Jack at the movie theater, just the two of them, no chaperone. After the picture show, they'll probably go to a soda fountain or maybe even a speakeasy. Her grandmother would be scandalized, but this is the new world, and young people are doing things differently now. The transformation of courtship from calling in parlors to dating in public spaces represents one of the most dramatic social changes in American history. This shift happened relatively quickly, primarily between 1900 and 1930, driven by a combination of economic changes, urbanization, technological innovation, and shifting attitudes about gender and independence. The word dating itself didn't enter common usage until around 1914, and it was initially slang with somewhat scandalous connotations. The Industrial Revolution fundamentally restructured how young people lived and worked. In rural agricultural communities, young people generally lived with their families until marriage. Courtship happened in family spaces, under family supervision. But as young people moved to cities for factory and office work, they gained unprecedented independence. They lived in boarding houses, earned their own wages, and spent time away from family oversight. This independence created both the need and the opportunity for new forms of courtship. The automobile deserves special mention as a technology that revolutionized dating. Before cars, young people's mobility was limited. Courting couples stayed in neighborhoods within walking distance of home and family. But cars, relatively affordable by the 1920s for middle-class families, offered privacy and mobility that transformed courtship. A young man with a car could take a young woman away from her neighborhood from supervision to places where they could be alone together. The back seat of a car became legendary as a space of intimacy, and scandalized adults worried immorality. Movies revolutionized dating by providing a respectable reason for young couples to be alone together in dark, public spaces. Movie theaters proliferated in American cities starting around 1910, offering cheap entertainment that was accessible to working-class youth. Going to the movies became one of the first widely accepted contexts for unchaperoned dating. The darkness of the theater, the emotional intensity of films, the opportunity to sit close together. All of this made movies ideal first dates. Dance halls and amusement parks provided other venues for unchaperoned socializing. Unlike formal balls that required introductions and maintained class boundaries, commercial dance halls welcomed anyone who could pay the admission. Young working-class women earning their own wages could go dancing with friends, meet young men, and enjoy entertainment that their parents' generation couldn't have imagined. This democratization of courtship, the idea that young people from different backgrounds might meet and court in public commercial spaces, horrified social conservatives but reflected the reality of urban, industrial life. The rise of treating illustrates the economic dimensions of early dating culture. Young working women earned wages, but usually not enough to fully support their lifestyle. Treating referred to men paying for women's entertainment, buying dinner, movie tickets, or dance hall admission. This created a somewhat transactional dynamic where women's company was exchanged for men's financial resources. The treating system made older middle-class observers nervous because it seemed uncomfortably close to prostitution, blurring the line between respectable courtship and economic exchange. Dating also changed the power dynamics of courtship. In the calling system, women and their families controlled courtship by deciding who could call and for how long. But in dating culture, men asked women out, chose the venue, and paid the expenses, giving them more control over the structure and progression of relationships. This shift from female-controlled calling to male-controlled dating had mixed implications for women's autonomy and safety. The 1920s, the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, are remembered as a period of dramatic social change, and dating was central to this transformation. Young women cut their hair into bobs, wore shorter skirts, smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol during Prohibition, and embraced a more overtly sexual style than their mother's generation. Petting, physical intimacy short of intercourse, became common and discussed to the horror of older generations. The line between respectable young women and loose women seemed to be blurring. Advice literature struggled to keep up with these changes. Older etiquette books, with their rules about calling cards and chaperone visits, were clearly obsolete. New advice books tried to provide guidance for the dating era, but they revealed deep anxieties about the new system. How many dates before a relationship was serious? What level of physical intimacy was acceptable? How could young women protect their reputations in a system that involved being alone with men they were still getting to know? The term dating itself reveals the transactional nature of the new system. To date originally meant to make an appointment, to schedule time. Dating involved a man asking a woman out to a specific event at a specific time, with the understanding that he would pay. This commodification of courtship made it more casual in some ways. Dates weren't necessarily serious. You might date multiple people before choosing one. But it also made courtship less personal in some ways, less embedded in community and family networks, more focused on entertainment and performance. Interestingly, not everyone embraced dating with equal enthusiasm. Many immigrant and working-class families tried to maintain traditional courtship practices, viewing dating as morally dangerous. African American communities navigated dating differently, with church and community organizations providing supervised social opportunities that balanced new freedoms with traditional values. Dating was primarily a white, middle-class phenomenon in its early years, though it gradually spread to other communities. The Great Depression temporarily slowed the dating revolution as economic hardship limited resources for entertainment and delayed marriages. But the core shift had occurred. Courtship had moved from private family spaces to public commercial venues, from family-supervised calling to couple-focused dating, from women controlling access to men controlling activities. These changes reflected and reinforced broader social transformations. Urbanization, the rise of consumer culture, increasing independence for young people, and changing gender norms. The year is 1955, and Susie is waiting by her locker, trying to look casual even though her heart is racing. She's wearing Bobby's class ring on a chain around her neck, visible above the collar of her Peter Pan blouse. He gave it to her last week at the drive-in, asking if she'd go steady with him. Now they're officially a couple, which means she won't date anyone else and he won't either. Her friends all have steady boyfriends too. It's just what you do in high school now. On Friday, they'll probably go to the sock hop, and afterward Bobby will drive them to Makeout Point in his father's Chevrolet. Life feels orderly, romantic, and full of possibility. The post-World War II period brought dramatic changes to American dating culture, changes that would define courtship for decades to come. After the Depression and war years, America was prosperous, optimistic, and determined to rebuild stable family life. This cultural mood produced what historians call the golden age of marriage. Americans married younger than their parents' generation had, marriage rates climbed to historic highs, and suburban family life became the cultural ideal. The concept of going steady emerged as a way of bringing order and commitment to teenage dating. Before going steady became common, high school students typically played the field, dating multiple people casually. The ideal was to be popular, to have many dating options. But by the 1950s, a new pattern emerged. Teenagers would date around briefly, then commit to exclusive relationships that could last months or even years. Going steady involved exchanging tokens, a class ring, a letterman's jacket, a special bracelet, that publicly announced the relationship. Adults were often uncomfortable with going steady because it seemed to encourage premature commitment and intimacy. Parents worried that steady couples would become too involved physically, that teenagers were playing at being married without the resources or maturity for actual marriage. But teenagers embraced going steady because it provided security and status. Having a steady boyfriend or girlfriend proved you were attractive and desirable, and it removed the anxiety of constantly seeking dates. The 1950s teenage culture was the first to have significant spending power and to be specifically targeted by marketers. Teenagers had part-time jobs, received allowances, and had disposable income to spend on records, clothes, movies, and dates. The music industry, film industry, and emerging television industry all catered to teenage tastes. This created a distinctive teenage culture separate from adult culture, with its own music, slang, and courtship norms. Drive-in movie theaters became iconic date venues in the 1950s. These outdoor theaters, where couples watched movies from their cars, offered privacy that traditional indoor theaters couldn't match. Parking at drive-ins or at secluded spots became synonymous with necking and petting. The back seat of a car remained the primary space for teenage sexual exploration, a fact that inspired both jokes and genuine parental anxiety. The double date emerged as a popular format that balanced independence with safety and supervision. Two couples would go out together, often with one couple providing transportation. Double dates allowed teenagers freedom from adult supervision while providing some mutual oversight. They also reduced pressure. Having friends along made dates more relaxed and less intensely romantic or sexual. Teenage dating followed elaborate informal rules. Boys were expected to ask girls out and to pay for dates. Girls were expected to be interested but not too eager, to accept invitations graciously, to look attractive but not provocative. The boy would pick the girl up at her home, meet her parents, and promise to have her home by curfew. First dates might be group activities, school dances, football games, parties. As relationships progressed, couples might double date or go on single dates to movies, dances, or restaurants. Advice literature for teenagers boomed in the post-war period. Magazines like 17 and Teen offered endless articles about dating, how to attract boys, how to be popular, how to know if he's serious, how far to go physically. These articles presented dating as a skill to be learned, with specific strategies for success. They also reinforced traditional gender roles. Girls should be pretty, pleasant, and never too smart. Boys should be confident, athletic, and able to provide. The sexual landscape of 1950s dating is more complicated than nostalgic memory suggests. While premarital sex was strongly discouraged and unmarried pregnancy was deeply shameful, surveys indicate that significant percentages of teenagers and young adults did have premarital sexual experience. The famous Kinsey reports, published in 1948 and 1953, revealed that American sexual behavior was considerably more varied and active than public discourse acknowledged. The ideal of chastity before marriage coexisted with the reality of considerable sexual activity, creating anxiety and hypocrisy. Petting became the compromise position, physical intimacy including kissing and touching, but stopping short of intercourse. Young people developed elaborate hierarchies of what was acceptable at different stages of relationships. First base, second base, third base, home run. This baseball metaphor for stages of physical intimacy dates to this period. The line between acceptable petting and unacceptable, going all the way, was policed by social pressure, fear of pregnancy, and genuine belief in the importance of virginity at marriage. For young women, navigating these contradictory expectations was particularly challenging. They were supposed to be attractive and date frequently to prove their desirability, but not too sexy or available. They were supposed to accept physical affection as proof of their boyfriend's feelings, but set firm limits to protect their reputations. The responsibility for controlling male sexuality was placed on females, creating the perverse logic that if sexual activity occurred, it was the girl's fault for not saying no firmly enough. College dating in the 1950s had its own culture. On many campuses, women's dormitories had strict curfews and sign-out procedures. Dating was formalized through sororities and fraternities, which organized mixers and established appropriate pairings. Pinning ceremonies, where a fraternity member gave his fraternity pin to his girlfriend, were elaborate social events announcing serious commitment. Going steady in college was often seen as a pre-engagement stage, with marriage expected shortly after graduation. The marriage age dropped significantly in the post-war period. Americans married younger than they had in generations, with average age at first marriage dropping to 20 for women and 22 for men by 1956. This was partly economic. The prosperity and housing boom made it possible for young couples to marry and establish households, but it was also cultural. Marriage was seen as the natural, expected goal of dating. Young people who didn't marry by their mid-20s were viewed with suspicion or pity. This era of going steady established patterns that would influence dating for decades. The expectation of exclusive relationships, the performance of commitment through tokens and public displays, the elaborate rules about physical intimacy, the assumption that dating led naturally to marriage. But underneath this apparent order and tradition, forces were building that would transform dating yet again. The sexual revolution was coming, and with it, everything would change. San Francisco, 1967. Summer of love. The park is filled with young people in flowing clothes and flowers, guitars and tambourines creating a soundtrack of change. A young woman named Sarah sits in the grass with a man she met 3 days ago. They've been living in the same commune, sharing meals and philosophy, and yes, sleeping together. Her mother back in Ohio would be horrified, but Sarah feels she's discovered something authentic, something her parents' generation, with their conventional marriages and suburban conformity, never understood. That love shouldn't be constrained by old rules, that the body isn't shameful, that connection between people shouldn't require legal contracts or religious sanction. The period from roughly 1960 to 1980 saw perhaps the most dramatic transformation in dating and sexual culture in modern history. A combination of social movements, technological innovation, and generational rebellion fundamentally altered how young people thought about relationships, sex, and commitment. The changes were so profound that older and younger generations often seemed to be speaking different languages about romance and relationships. The birth control pill, approved by the FDA in 1960, was revolutionary in separating sex from reproduction. For the first time in human history, women had reliable, convenient control over their fertility. The pill's impact on dating culture cannot be overstated. When sex no longer carried the near-certain risk of pregnancy, the calculus of premarital sexual activity changed dramatically. The fear that had enforced sexual restraint was significantly reduced, enabling the sexual liberation that defined the era. The counterculture movement of the 1960s explicitly rejected the conformity and sexual restraint of the 1950s. Young people questioned authority, experimented with alternative lifestyles, and embraced sexual freedom as part of broader personal liberation. The phrase "free love" captured the era's rejection of traditional courtship rules, marriage as the sole legitimate context for sex, and the double standard that judged female sexuality more harshly than male sexuality. Hippie communes experimented with alternative relationship structures, including open relationships, group marriage, and rejection of legal marriage entirely. While communes represented a small minority of young people, their experiments with relationship structures challenged mainstream assumptions about what relationships should look like. The idea that relationships could take forms other than monogamous marriage gained cultural visibility, even if most people didn't personally adopt these alternatives. The women's liberation movement profoundly impacted dating and relationship culture. Feminists challenged the double standard that celebrated male sexual experience while shaming women's sexuality. They questioned traditional gender roles in dating that expected men to initiate, lead, and pay, while women remained passive recipients of male attention. The idea that women could and should pursue their own pleasure, could initiate relationships, could choose not to marry at all, was revolutionary. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, articulated the dissatisfaction many educated women felt with being limited to roles as wives and mothers. Gloria Steinem and other feminist leaders argued that women's liberation required sexual freedom and control over their own bodies. The slogan, "The personal is political," insisted that private relationship dynamics reflected and reinforced broader systems of power and oppression. Dating in the 1970s became less formal and more varied than in previous decades. The concept of going steady declined as casual dating reemerged. Young people might sleep together without being in committed relationships, might date multiple people simultaneously, might live together without being engaged or married. The question, "What are we?" became common because relationship status was no longer clearly defined through engagement or going steady. Cohabitation before marriage became increasingly common and increasingly acceptable, at least in urban, educated communities. Living together served multiple purposes. It was practical, sharing housing costs. It was a trial marriage, testing compatibility before legal commitment. And it was a statement of independence from traditional morality that insisted sex should wait for marriage. By 1980, cohabitation was common enough that most Americans knew couples living together, unmarried. The gay liberation movement, catalyzed by the Stonewall riots in 1969, brought LGBTQ relationships into public consciousness. While same-sex relationships had always existed, they'd been hidden, stigmatized, and criminalized. Gay liberation insisted on visibility, pride, and the right to love openly. This movement challenged the assumption that heterosexual relationships were the only legitimate form of romance, and that marriage was the only goal of courtship. Singles bars became popular venues for meeting potential partners. Unlike school, workplace, or community settings where people met organically, singles bars existed specifically for strangers to meet with romantic or sexual intent. This commodification of dating accelerated as the personal ads in newspapers and magazines grew in popularity, allowing people to advertise themselves and specify what they were seeking in potential partners. The sexual revolution had complicated effects on gender dynamics in dating. On one hand, women gained more freedom to pursue their own desires, to initiate relationships, and to have sex without commitment. On the other hand, the expectation of sexual availability could pressure women into sexual activity they weren't comfortable with. The logic that sex was natural and healthy could be used to dismiss women's desire for emotional connection or commitment as old-fashioned hang-ups. Not everyone participated in or approved of sexual liberation. Conservative religious communities maintained traditional courtship practices and abstinence before marriage. Many African American communities, navigating ongoing racism and economic challenges, viewed sexual liberation as a white middle-class luxury. Working-class communities often maintained more traditional expectations, even as middle-class educated youth embraced sexual freedom. The sexual revolution also brought challenges and costs. Sexually transmitted infections became more common with increased sexual activity and multiple partners. The herpes outbreak of the late 1970s, the first modern STI that couldn't be cured, created anxiety about casual sex. Women who embraced sexual freedom sometimes found that male partners used that freedom to avoid commitment entirely, creating new forms of frustration and inequality. Marriage rates began declining and divorce rates soared, reaching their historical peak around 1980. The no-fault divorce laws passed in many states made ending marriages easier, and changing attitudes made divorce less stigmatized. The assumption that marriage was permanent, that couples would stay together regardless of happiness, was crumbling. This created both opportunity. People trapped in unhappy or abusive marriages could leave, and anxiety about the stability of family structures. The average age at first marriage began rising, reversing the trend from the 1950s. Young people were delaying marriage to pursue education and careers, to experience different relationships, to establish themselves individually before coupling. The idea that marriage was the inevitable goal of dating, that it should happen in one's early 20s, was no longer universal. By 1980, dating and relationship culture had been transformed. The changes were uneven. Urban educated communities embraced sexual freedom more than rural religious ones, and generational divides remained sharp. But the fundamental assumptions underlying courtship had shifted. Sex before marriage was now common and accepted. Living together before marriage was normal. Women could initiate relationships. Casual sex didn't necessarily lead to serious relationships. Marriage was optional, and there were multiple legitimate forms of relationships. The world of dating had opened up, for better and worse, in ways that would have been unimaginable just 20 years earlier. It's Friday night in 1982, and the bar is packed. The music is loud, probably something by Journey or Hall & Oates, and the lighting is dim with strategic spotlights creating small stages throughout the space. Women in shoulder pads and men with feathered hair circle the room, making eye contact, breaking it, moving to the bar, to the dance floor, working up the courage to approach strangers or hoping to be approached. This is TGI Fridays, or perhaps its local equivalent, and this is The Scene. The singles bar culture that defined 1980s dating for many young professionals. The 1980s and 1990s saw the rise of a distinct singles culture, particularly in urban areas. As marriage was delayed and divorce became more common, a significant population of single adults in their 20s, 30s, and beyond needed ways to meet potential partners. The bar scene, nightclubs, speed dating, personal ads, and eventually video dating services all emerged to serve this market. Singles bars walked a fine line between legitimate social venues and meat markets. These establishments, often featuring happy hours, live music, or themed nights, provided spaces where single people could gather with the explicit purpose of meeting potential partners. Unlike regular bars where patrons might be there for various reasons, everyone at a singles bar was theoretically available and looking. This created both opportunity and pressure. The singles bar scene had its own unwritten rules and rituals. Women often went in groups for safety and support, while men might go alone or with a wingman. Elaborate games of approach and rejection played out. Eye contact across the room, the guy buying drinks as conversation starters, the exchange of phone numbers written on cocktail napkins, the dance floor as testing ground for chemistry. The whole experience could feel simultaneously exciting and exhausting, liberating and objectifying. Speed dating emerged in the late 1990s as a more efficient approach to meeting potential partners. In a speed dating event, singles would have brief conversations, typically 3 to 7 minutes, with a series of potential matches. At the end of each mini-date, participants would note whether they'd like to see that person again. If both parties indicated interest, the organizers would facilitate an exchange of contact information. This systematized approach to dating reflected the increasing application of business efficiency principles to romance. Personal ads in newspapers and magazines offered another avenue for meeting partners. These ads had existed in various forms for centuries, but they became mainstream and more acceptable in the 1980s. People would place classified ads describing themselves and what they sought in a partner, often using codes and abbreviations. SWF, single white female, GSOH, good sense of humor, NS, non-smoker. Respondents would write letters or call a phone service to connect with the ad placer. Personal ads required interesting skills. How to represent yourself appealingly in just a few words, how to specify preferences without seeming too picky, how to signal serious intent while maintaining some mystery. The ads revealed how people thought about themselves and what they wanted. Physical descriptions dominated: height, weight, appearance, followed by lifestyle preferences: enjoys hiking, likes wine, with personality traits sometimes mentioned but usually secondary. The 1980s also saw the emergence of video dating services. These businesses would film video profiles of clients who would describe themselves, their interests, and what they sought in a partner. Other clients could watch these videos and request meetings with people who interested them. This was more expensive than personal ads, but provided richer information. You could see what someone looked like, hear their voice, get a sense of their personality. Video dating services were widely mocked in popular culture, but actually facilitated many relationships. Self-help books about dating proliferated during this period. Books like Smart Women, Foolish Choices, and eventually, The Rules offered strategic advice about how to attract and keep partners. These books often reinforced traditional gender dynamics. Women were advised to be mysterious and less available. Men were advised to be confident and persistent. The advice was sometimes contradictory and reflected ongoing anxiety about how gender equality should or shouldn't change dating dynamics. The concept of biological clock entered popular discourse in the 1980s, creating pressure particularly on professional women who delayed childbearing for career development. Media stories about declining fertility with age created anxiety that women needed to secure partners and have children by certain ages or risk missing their opportunity. This pressure coexisted awkwardly with feminist messages about women's independence and the validity of choosing not to marry or have children. Workplace dating became increasingly common as more women entered professional careers. Many people met future spouses through work, which made sense given how much time adults spent in workplaces. But workplace romance created complications. Power dynamics if one person supervised another, gossip and attention from coworkers, and awkwardness if relationships ended. Some workplaces began developing policies about office relationships to manage potential problems. The AIDS crisis profoundly impacted dating culture in the 1980s and 1990s. Initially affecting primarily gay men, AIDS quickly spread to other populations. The crisis reinforced fears about casual sex and multiple partners. Discussions about safer sex, condom use, and testing became necessary parts of dating for sexually active adults. The crisis also galvanized LGBTQ communities, creating solidarity in the face of government indifference and social stigma. Dating advice increasingly emphasized communication skills and emotional intelligence. The therapy culture of the 1980s and 1990s encouraged people to understand their relationship patterns, work through baggage from previous relationships, and develop healthier communication styles. The assumption that good relationships required work and skill, not just chemistry and luck, became mainstream. Singles events became more diverse and creative. Cooking classes for singles, hiking clubs, book groups, volunteer opportunities. These activities-based approaches to meeting partners were generally viewed as more authentic than bar scenes because they brought together people with shared interests. The activity itself provided conversation topics and reduced pressure compared to environments where the only purpose was romantic connection. The concept of the biological family, vs. chosen family, gained traction, particularly in urban communities. Single adults formed close friendship networks that provided emotional support, practical help, and social connection traditionally associated with family. For many people, particularly LGBTQ individuals, often rejected by biological families, these friend networks were more important than romantic relationships in providing stability and belonging. By the late 1990s, a significant cultural shift was occurring. Being single was increasingly viewed not as a temporary unfortunate state, but as a potentially positive life stage or even permanent choice. Books like The New Single Woman celebrated women's independence and fulfillment outside marriage. Television shows like Sex and the City portrayed single urban life as glamorous and fulfilling. While marriage remained desirable for many, its status as the only acceptable goal of adult life was diminishing. The singles culture of the 1980s and 1990s normalized being unmarried in one's 30s and beyond, created infrastructure for meeting partners outside traditional social networks, and began shifting the focus from marriage as inevitable destiny to marriage as one among several acceptable choices. These changes set the stage for the digital revolution in dating that was about to transform courtship once again. Sarah sits at her computer, the blue glow of the monitor illuminating her face in the otherwise dark room. It's 1999 and she's on Match.com, filling out her profile. This feels slightly embarrassing. Isn't online dating for people who can't meet anyone in real life? But several of her friends have tried it, and one even met her boyfriend online. The profile asks about interests, education, what she's seeking. She uploads a photo, carefully chosen to be attractive but not overly staged. She clicks submit and waits, both nervous and excited about this strange new way of meeting people. The rise of online dating represents one of the most dramatic transformations in courtship. Since dating moved out of parlors and into public spaces in the early 20th century. What began as a stigmatized activity for the desperate has become the most common way couples meet, fundamentally altering how people find romantic partners. Match.com, launched in 1995, was one of the first mainstream dating websites. The premise was simple: create a profile describing yourself and what you're looking for, browse others' profiles, and send messages to people who interest you. This digitized the personal ad concept, but made it more sophisticated. Profiles could include multiple photos, detailed descriptions, and search filters by age, location, interests, and other preferences. Early online dating faced significant stigma. Admitting you'd met someone online often prompted sympathetic or pitying reactions. The assumption was that online dating was for people who were socially awkward, desperate, or somehow unable to meet partners through normal channels. Television shows and movies portrayed online dating as either pathetic or dangerous, full of catfishers and serial killers. The stigma gradually diminished through the 2000s as more people tried online dating and shared positive experiences. The normalization accelerated as websites marketed themselves to specific demographics. JDate for Jewish singles, eHarmony for people seeking marriage, OkCupid for younger, more liberal users. This specialization made online dating feel less like a last resort and more like an efficient way to find compatible partners. eHarmony, founded in 2000, introduced algorithmic matching based on compatibility questionnaires. Users answered extensive questions about personality, values, and preferences, and the algorithm suggested compatible matches. This approach appealed to people uncomfortable with the shopping feel of browsing profiles and to those seeking serious relationships rather than casual dating. eHarmony heavily marketed itself to marriage-minded users, reducing stigma by positioning online dating as a legitimate path to traditional relationship goals. The psychology of online dating differs fundamentally from traditional dating. In person, attraction and chemistry develop through complex nonverbal cues, conversation flow, and ineffable chemistry. Online, decisions are made based on photos and text descriptions, creating a more rationalized, commodified approach to mate selection. People develop complex screening strategies, certain keywords, photo styles, or profile details that signal compatibility or problems. Online dating also introduced the paradox of choice. With hundreds or thousands of potential matches available, users could spend hours browsing profiles, always wondering if someone better might be just one more click away. This abundance of options could undermine satisfaction even when good matches were found, as people always wondered about other possibilities. Research shows that more choice doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes or greater happiness. The process of creating online dating profiles required people to market themselves in new ways. Users had to condense complex personalities into catchy headlines and brief descriptions, choose photos that were attractive but seemed authentic, and describe what they sought without seeming too picky or too desperate. Profile creation became an art form, with friends often consulted for feedback on how to present oneself optimally. Online dating also raised new questions about honesty and deception. How much photo enhancement was acceptable? Was it deceptive to use photos from several years ago when you were thinner or younger? Should you disclose significant information like having children or being separated, but not yet divorced? The gap between online presentation and offline reality created potential for disappointment when couples finally met in person. The first in-person meeting after online communication became its own new ritual. The coffee date, deliberately brief and public, designed to see if online chemistry translated to real life. These first meetings often felt awkward because expectations had built up through email or chat exchanges. Sometimes the chemistry was immediate, often it wasn't, leading to the uncomfortable realization that extensive online communication didn't guarantee real-world compatibility. Online dating also enabled specific subcultures and preferences to find each other. People with niche interests, specific religious beliefs, or particular lifestyle choices could find like-minded partners much more easily than through chance encounters in daily life. This was particularly significant for LGBTQ individuals, who could connect with other LGBTQ people safely and easily, especially in areas where being openly gay remained difficult. The economics of online dating evolved over time. Early sites like Match.com charged subscription fees, positioning themselves as services worth paying for. Free sites like OkCupid emerged, supported by advertising, making online dating accessible to everyone. The tension between free and paid models reflected different business strategies and different user bases, with paid sites generally attracting users seeking serious relationships, while free sites drew a broader range of intentions. By the late 2000s, online dating had become sufficiently mainstream that admitting you'd met your partner online no longer prompted pity or concern. Survey data began showing that significant percentages of new relationships started online, particularly among certain demographics: younger people, urban professionals, LGBTQ individuals. The infrastructure of dating had fundamentally shifted from chance encounters in physical spaces to deliberate searching through digital databases. The smartphone revolution of the late 2000s set the stage for the next transformation. Mobile devices made online dating portable and constant, rather than something done at a computer. Location-based features enabled apps to show potential matches nearby. The stage was set for dating apps that would make online dating even more pervasive and transform it yet again. Looking back, the transition from personal ads to online dating to mobile apps reveals a consistent pattern. Technology making mate search more efficient, more convenient, and more individualized, while also making it more commodified, more overwhelming, and potentially more superficial. Each technological innovation promised to solve problems created by previous systems while introducing new complications. Your thumb moves almost without thinking. Left, left, right, left, right, left. You're lying in bed, half watching television, casually swiping through faces on Tinder. Some profiles make you pause. A particularly attractive photo, an amusing bio. Most you dismiss in seconds based on nothing more than a first photo. It feels almost like a game, this rapid-fire judgment of potential partners. Somewhere out there, someone is probably swiping through your photos right now, making the same split-second decisions. This is dating in 2015, and it feels simultaneously full of possibility and strangely hollow. Tinder, launched in 2012, revolutionized online dating by introducing the swipe interface and location-based matching. The app was brilliantly simple. Users saw photos of nearby potential matches and swiped right for interested or left for not interested. If both users swiped right on each other, it was a match and they could message each other. This gamified interface made online dating faster, more casual, and potentially addictive. The swipe mechanism tapped into psychological reward systems similar to slot machines. The unpredictability of matches, never knowing when the next right swipe would lead to a match, created variable reward schedules that behavioral psychologists know are particularly effective at encouraging repeated behavior. Users would find themselves swiping compulsively, seeking the dopamine hit of a new match. Tinder's reputation as a hookup app wasn't entirely accurate, but it did reflect and enable more casual dating culture. The app's emphasis on photos over detailed profiles, its location-based matching showing people nearby, and its association with spontaneous meetups all suggested casual connections rather than serious relationship seeking. While many users did find long-term relationships through Tinder, the app's design and culture emphasized easy, low-commitment interactions. The swipe culture spread rapidly beyond Tinder. Bumble launched in 2014, using similar mechanics but requiring women to message first, attempting to shift power dynamics. Hinge marketed itself as designed to be deleted, for people seeking relationships rather than hookups. Coffee Meets Bagel sent users a limited number of curated matches daily, trying to combat the overwhelming abundance of choices. Each app tried to carve out a niche, while relying on the basic swipe mechanic that had proven so engaging. Dating apps accelerated the commodification of romance that online dating had begun. People became products to be evaluated and selected based primarily on appearance and brief text descriptions. The ease of finding new matches reduced incentive to work through difficulties or give people chances beyond first impressions. If a date went badly or a conversation fizzled, you could simply open the app and find new options immediately. The phenomenon of ghosting, ceasing all communication with someone without explanation, became endemic to app-based dating. The abundance of options and the superficiality of initial connections made it easier to simply disappear than to have uncomfortable conversations about lack of interest. While ghosting had always existed, app culture normalized it to a degree that many found frustrating and hurtful. Breadcrumbing, benching, zombieing, and numerous other terms emerged to describe manipulative or ambiguous dating behaviors. Breadcrumbing meant giving just enough attention to keep someone interested without committing to actual dates or relationships. Benching meant keeping someone as a backup option while pursuing others. Zombieing meant ghosting someone, then reappearing weeks or months later as if nothing happened. These behaviors flourished in app culture's abundance and anonymity. The paradox of choice that had affected online dating became even more pronounced with apps. Users, particularly in large cities, could have dozens or hundreds of matches, more potential dates than they could possibly pursue. This abundance created chronic dissatisfaction. Why commit to this person when someone better might be the next swipe? Research showed that online daters often felt exhausted and disappointed despite having more options than any previous generation. Photo culture became increasingly important as apps emphasized visual presentation. Users learned to carefully curate their photos. One attractive face shot, one full body shot, one showing an interesting hobby, one with friends demonstrating social value. The pressure to present a perfect, attractive version of oneself increased, as did anxiety about how one's photos were being judged by others. Apps also enabled extremely specific filtering. Users could screen by age, height, education, ethnicity, religion, political views, and more. This efficiency in finding supposedly compatible matches also meant that people might never encounter potential partners outside their narrow criteria. The serendipity that characterized previous eras of dating, meeting someone at a party who wasn't your usual type and discovering unexpected compatibility, was lost when algorithms only showed pre-filtered matches. The role of apps in facilitating casual sex became culturally significant. While hookup culture preceded apps, the ease of finding willing partners through apps like Tinder made casual sexual encounters more accessible than ever. This had mixed effects. Liberation for people seeking casual sex without relationship strings, but also pressure to be sexually available and confusion about whether connections were romantic or purely physical. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated trends that were already developing and introduced new patterns. With in-person dating impossible during lockdowns, video dates became common. People spent weeks or months chatting with matches before meeting in person, sometimes developing strong emotional connections before physical meetings. The pandemic also prompted many to reassess what they wanted from relationships, with some reports suggesting people sought more serious connections rather than casual encounters. Dating app fatigue became a widely discussed phenomenon by the late 2010s. Many users described feeling exhausted by the constant swiping, disappointed by matches that didn't lead anywhere, frustrated by ghosting and unclear intentions, and cynical about finding genuine connection through apps. Yet they continued using apps because alternatives seemed limited, particularly for people whose work and lifestyle didn't provide many opportunities to meet potential partners organically. The racial and body type preferences encoded in swipe culture revealed uncomfortable truths about attraction and bias. Studies showed that Asian men and Black women faced systematic discrimination in online dating, receiving fewer matches than other groups even when controlling for other factors. Similarly, people who didn't conform to conventional beauty standards found app-based dating particularly challenging, as the visual-first nature of swiping emphasized appearance over other qualities. By 2020, dating apps had become so pervasive that they were simply how most single people, particularly those under 40, approached dating. Meeting through friends, at work, at bars, or through shared activities still happened, but was supplemented or replaced by app-based matching for many people. The question was no longer whether to use apps, but which apps to use, and how to use them effectively, while maintaining sanity and optimism. Modern dating thus exists in a strange state. More choice than ever before, but less satisfaction, more connections, but less depth, more efficiency, but less romance, more freedom, but more anxiety. The tools have become incredibly sophisticated, but the fundamental human challenges, finding someone compatible, building trust, creating meaningful connection, remain as difficult as ever. As we settle into the 2020s, dating culture finds itself at a fascinating crossroads. Technology has transformed how we meet partners in ways that would seem like science fiction to previous generations. We can browse thousands of potential matches while lying in bed, video chat with someone on another continent, and use algorithms that supposedly predict compatibility with mathematical precision. Yet despite, or perhaps because of, all this technology, many people report feeling disconnected, overwhelmed, and pessimistic about finding meaningful relationships. The pandemic accelerated trends that were already emerging. Video dating, once seen as a last resort, became normal and even expected during lockdowns. Many people discovered they actually preferred initial video dates to meeting strangers at bars or coffee shops. Video calls allowed getting to know someone from the safety and comfort of home, saved time and money, and helped establish emotional connection before physical meetings. Even as in-person dating resumed, video dates remained part of the dating landscape for many. The pandemic also prompted broader reflection about relationships and priorities. Isolation highlighted for many people how much they valued connection and partnership. Some who'd been content with casual dating decided they wanted committed relationships. Others who'd felt pressured to pursue relationships realized they were happy single. The disruption of normal life created space for questioning assumptions about what kinds of relationships actually brought fulfillment. Marriage rates have continued their long decline that began in the 1970s. In 2020, only about 50% of American adults were married, compared to over 70% in 1970. The average age at first marriage continues rising, now around 30 for men and 28 for women. These statistics reflect multiple factors: economic pressure making marriage less affordable, changing attitudes making marriage less necessary, and people prioritizing education and career before partnering. But declining marriage rates don't necessarily mean declining commitment. Many couples cohabit long-term without marrying, forming stable partnerships that function like marriages without legal recognition. Others practice serial monogamy, having a series of committed relationships over their lifetime rather than one permanent partnership. The diversity of acceptable relationship forms has expanded dramatically from the narrow, marriage-focused culture of the 1950s. Polyamory and ethical non-monogamy have gained mainstream visibility, if not universal acceptance. While still a minority practice, consensual non-monogamous relationships have become more common and more openly discussed. Dating apps include features for people seeking non-monogamous connections. The assumption that commitment necessarily means sexual and romantic exclusivity is being questioned by people who find that traditional monogamy doesn't suit their needs or values. Technology continues evolving in ways that will likely impact dating. Virtual reality dating experiences allow people to feel present with partners in shared virtual spaces, potentially transforming long-distance relationships. AI-powered chatbots and virtual companions are becoming increasingly sophisticated, raising questions about the future role of technology in meeting human needs for connection and intimacy. While human relationships will undoubtedly remain primary, the boundaries between human and artificial companionship may blur. The role of social media in dating and relationships has become increasingly complex. Platforms like Instagram influence dating by serving as additional screening tools. People research potential dates online before meeting, and social media presence becomes part of attraction and evaluation. But social media also creates new forms of jealousy and insecurity, as partners can see each other's online interactions and connections. The question of appropriate boundaries around social media in relationships remains contentious. There's growing discussion about dating app design and its psychological effects. Some new apps are explicitly trying to create less superficial, more authentic experiences. Features that encourage voice messages or video profiles rather than just photos, prompts that go deeper than typical small talk, limits on daily swipes to reduce overwhelming choice. These design choices attempt to address app fatigue and the superficiality of swipe culture. The impact of economic inequality on dating culture is receiving more attention. Dating in expensive cities requires significant financial resources, potentially excluding people without disposable income. Traditional expectations that men pay for dates create pressure on men while infantilizing women. Questions about how to split costs, whether financial compatibility matters, and how economic inequality affects relationship formation are being discussed more openly than in previous eras that took gendered economic roles for granted. Mental health awareness is shaping how people approach relationships. Concepts like attachment theory, emotional availability, and trauma-informed relating have entered popular discourse. People are more likely to seek therapy before or during relationships, to discuss their mental health challenges with partners, and to recognize that good relationships require emotional skills and self-awareness. This represents a shift from seeing relationship success as mainly about finding the right person to understanding it, as also about being emotionally healthy oneself. The future of dating will likely involve continued tension between efficiency and authenticity, between leveraging technology and maintaining human connection, between the freedom of abundant choice and the contentment that comes from committed selection. These tensions aren't new. They're contemporary expressions of eternal human challenges around connection, commitment, and community. What seems clear is that dating will continue diversifying rather than converging on a single model. Different people will pursue different approaches. Some will swipe casually, others will avoid apps entirely. Some will seek traditional marriage, others will create alternative partnership structures. Some will prioritize passion and romance, others will emphasize practical compatibility. This pluralism is probably healthy, reflecting genuine diversity in human needs and preferences, rather than imposing a single standard of what relationships should look like. Perhaps the most important lesson from this long history of dating and courtship is that there's no golden age to return to, no perfect system that once existed and should be restored. Every era has had its strengths and limitations, its freedoms and constraints, its romantics and its pragmatists. Our ancestors dealt with arranged marriages that ignored individual preference. Our grandparents navigated rigid gender roles and limited premarital freedom. Our parents wrestled with the aftermath of sexual revolution and rising divorce rates. We grapple with overwhelming choice and digital disconnection. But through all these changes, certain truths remain. Humans need connection, seek companionship, fall in love, form partnerships, create families however defined, and find meaning through relationship with others. The forms change, the tools evolve, the rules shift, but the fundamental human desires for intimacy, belonging, and shared life persist. How we pursue these desires will continue evolving, but the desires themselves are ancient and enduring, connecting us to every generation that has ever negotiated the beautiful, complicated process of finding someone to share life with. Tonight, we've traveled through thousands of years of human connection. From ancient marriage contracts carved in clay to modern swipes that disappear in seconds, from chaperoned parlor visits to unsupervised video dates in our pajamas, from courtly love poetry to Netflix and chill. We've discovered that while the methods of courtship have changed dramatically, the fundamental human longing for connection, the anxiety of pursuing someone attractive, the hope of finding partnership, and the complications of negotiating intimacy, these remain remarkably constant across centuries and cultures. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the endlessly fascinating history of dating and romance. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your heart recognize what's real. May you trust your instincts about who deserves your time. And may you find the kind of connection that feels like coming home.